an absurdity.
When is an election campaign not an election campaign?
This year, Australians will have an opportunity to elect a new government and a new strong coalition government to get our country back on track.
This election, there will be a very clear choice.
We can all get a little fixated on formal election campaigns. That is, the period that starts when the Prime Minister asks the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and nominates a date for the election.
When can we expect a date to be set?
When I drive to Government House.
The Albanese government has had the wrong priorities. It's prioritised the agendas of inner-city Green voters, of activists and of union bosses.
We're here today to make a really important announcement that will bring up this wonderful city into being even better in the future.
But for all intents and purposes, the election campaign has begun. Last week, the Prime Minister started the annual electioneering tour of the outer states, announcing road and housing projects, which were shovel-ready, in Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. This week, it's been New South Wales and Tasmania and the NBN.
As a result of our changes, across Braddon, 10,000 more homes and businesses will be connected to high-speed broadband.
Government is living beyond its means. It's spending what it can't afford. And it's hurting Australians.
Then on Sunday, opposition leader Peter Dutton held a rally in the Melbourne seat of Chisholm.
Great to be back in Victoria.
With Victorian gains crucial to the Coalition's chances of winning back government, setting out some priorities he had already been spelling out on social media.
Here are 5 policies which we've announced that you may not have heard of.
The Prime Minister and opposition leader have now got their obligatory slogans, but the nature of their campaigns is quite different. The PM is Mr Practical. It's all about on-the-ground announcements like infrastructure or spending which will help towns losing big employers. He's been seen in mining towns and at cattle stations. After the political cost of the Voice referendum, any lofty social ambitions are not front and centre.
We will govern with respect for the views, values and the vision of everyday Australians.
The PM's appearances around the country aim to counter Peter Dutton's claims that Labor is only interested in inner-city woke agendas. The outer states are also increasingly in play, seats in the Northern Territory and WA as well as Tasmania. But there is something a little odd about the Dutton campaign pitch.
If you have a look at the sugar hits, you can provide support to people and people appreciate some support, obviously, particularly for energy costs or other support that the government might provide. But people are smarter than that.
Peter Dutton, there was a big build-up to a speech, but not a single new policy announced. And this morning he was out there describing cost of living relief as a sugar hit.
This is supposed to be a cost of living election, yet the opposition leader has yet to specifically target the issue, other than in the broadest terms. Coalition sources say this is because while the cost of living may be the number one issue with voters, it is not one where the opposition has any advantage. This is a material change from last year when the cost of living was biting the government hard. The Coalition is instead concentrating on other hot buttons like housing, migration and claims of big government spending instead of the cost of living.
I think it's still very much a dominant issue, but in terms of how it's playing out, we have talk of rate cuts. There's certainly wage increases in certain parts of the economy. Some housing and rental prices are stabilising. Perhaps there might be an easing effect before the election.
Peter Dutton's policy priority list includes returning the number of Medicare-funded psych appointments back to pandemic levels, housing infrastructure, cutting migration and foreign investment in housing, cutting the number of public servants and law and order. Now, just months from an election, the Coalition remains light on policy detail. Peter Dutton has announced some details in the contentious area of migration.
We'll impose a 2-year ban on foreign investors and temporary residents purchasing existing Australian homes. We will reduce the permanent migration program by 25% for 2 years, from 185,000 to 140,000, and we'll return it back over the next couple of years to more sustainable long-term levels.
But just how this would be achieved remains unclear.
There's 2 things to understand about a commitment to cut permanent migration in the way Mr Dutton is proposing. The first is it won't actually make a lot of difference in terms of net migration. If Mr Dutton wants to cut the permanent migration program, he would actually have to cut partner visas when the law requires him to increase the number of partner visas. Now let's assume he doesn't decide to cut partner visas and he leaves them alone and he decides to cut skilled stream even more than he is proposing. Then he runs into other difficulties. Firstly, with a strong labour market, we have a booming employer-sponsored visa category. No government has ever capped that category. Secondly, we have a large number of regional visas, which the National Party has said are off limits. And thirdly, Mr Dutton says he wants to increase the number of construction tradies coming into the country. I frankly think his arithmetic does not work.
Has your life been improved under Mr Albanese by Labor hiring an extra 36,000 public servants costing $6 billion a year? Of course it hasn't.
Cutting the public service is not without complications this time around for the Coalition. In government, it contracted out thousands of jobs, often through the Big Four accounting firms, to fill public service jobs. That made the headcount look better, but was much more expensive. The Albanese government has already booked savings of $4 billion from moving some 8,700 roles back to the public service. It has also hired staff to fill the shortages exposed in the robo-debt and veterans scandals, which in some cases led to suicides.
The public service is essential public infrastructure. I mean, it provides services to veterans, to families, to those on payments, but it also does important work in approvals and regulatory work. It touches every Australian's life, one way or another. And Peter Dutton and his team want to go back to the era of robo-debt.
There is, however, a question for the government too. It emerged last week that the updated budget figures presume no increase in the public service wages bill, despite wage increases being in the pipeline, a shortfall estimated to be as much as $7 billion over 4 years. For now, it is concentrating on the cost of living issue.
I think inevitably, whatever the problem du jour is, in this case, cost of living, the incumbent gets some blame. It's such a tricky, knotty problem to tackle.
But if the Coalition doesn't think the cost of living is an issue of difference with the government, is there enough momentum to provoke a change of government, which would be the first after one term since before the Second World War?
Listen, I don't think people, or most people, hate Anthony Albanese. The baseball bats aren't there. But neither do I think that either major party leader is loved at the moment. In the past, we've had, these big personalities, Kevin Rudd, Malcolm Turnbull. We simply haven't got a figure like that in Australian politics at the moment on either side. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've got a close vote position